Welcome back to Session 3, where we will focus on individualized education programs, IEPs, for multilingual learners. Section 3, Special Factors. The session is a component of a six-part series addressing the intersection of English language acquisition and IEPs through the building of linguistically responsive IEPs for multilingual learners. Today's primary facilitator is Melissa Franz, Maine Department of Education's Teacher Leader Fellow in the Office of Teaching and Learning. Leora Byras, Education Specialist in the Office of Special Services and Inclusive Education, and Jane Armstrong, ESOL, English for Speakers of Other Languages, State Specialist, will be accompanying Melissa to answer any DOE-specific questions related to special education and multilingual programming. A central theme of this series is the importance of collaboration in supporting Maine's multilingual learner population, particularly those with disabilities. Collaboration, as we know, is a shared responsibility both within the Maine Department of Education and across the state in our collective roles and responsibilities. Again, thank you for joining today's session, focusing on IEPs for multilingual learners, Section 3, Special Factors. Let's get started.
To our textbook that if you attend all 6 sessions, you'll be receiving at the end of our final session in June, the IEPs for English learners and other diverse learners by John Hoover and James Patton. A lot of the framing of our presentation today comes from their book and the research they've done examining IEPs for multilingual learners. We're going to use English learner and multilingual learner interchangeably today. We've talked about it previously. English learner is a federally designated term. In Maine, we use multilingual learner, but L in English learner is still prominent in research and resources. So you'll see them use both today. So this graphic, visually not very appealing, but important graphic conceptualizing how we provide the education for diverse learners with disabilities using these skill sets of recognizing the importance of cultural and linguistic diversity and how we use that to shape our instruction and our attitudes in supporting diverse learners. Next slide, please. So our work today is predicated on these assumptions that as we talk about crafting a culturally and linguistically responsive individual education plan, we're assuming that these key things have happened prior to the IEP development for multilingual learners. We presume that the referral and assessment process is consistent with the IDEA. We presume that English language proficiency is embedded throughout the assessment process and considered as students are being identified, that multiple forms of assessment and evaluation were used in a culturally and linguistically responsive framework, and that IEP team includes members that can speak to an English learner's specific cultural and linguistic factors. Next slide, please. Special educators are probably aware of Andrew v. Douglas, the Supreme Court ruling, but I wanted to highlight this ruling for both special educators and ESOL teachers because I think it's really important to understand what an IEP is designed for, what the law expects us to do and provide through an IEP. So prior to this legislation, basically an IEP was around students making their minimal gains. And the Supreme Court ruled in this case that there's a higher standard that we must use to determine educational benefit. And that standard is that those IEP goals are appropriately ambitious and that we must offer an IEP that's reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress that's appropriate in light of their circumstances. So thinking about that highlighted box there, that highlighted text, what do you think that means for multilingual learners? I want you to take a minute and think about that in crafting an IEP for a multilingual learner. What does it mean to offer them an IEP reasonably calculated for them to make progress in light of their disability and their language-related needs? And in a moment, I'm going to ask you to put your thoughts in the chat, but I'd like to give you just maybe a minute or so to think on that before you start to type. So if you have thoughts on what does that mean for multilingual learners, what are their circumstances that we would be considering, and how would that IEP be crafted for them to make progress in light of those considerations and circumstances? What are the things we need to think about? Go ahead and add it to the chat if you have thoughts. So we're considering taking into account students' English language proficiency, both their L1, right? Their home language or their native languages, in addition to their English language skills. I see people writing some things, considering their cultural experience, their language barriers, how to provide SDI so it's accessible, that language learning is part of their goals. Instruction may need to be in English as well as their home language. Yes, that's an important consideration and a challenge for us in public schools. Proficiency in native language, yes. Considering services and goals that work with language services. Absolutely, the collaboration. Yep, the variance between acquiring spoken and academic language. Prior schooling definitely has an impact. Yep, depending on ages, language, excellent examples. Next slide, please. And all of your callouts in the chat highlight this quote, right? That diminished emphasis on ELD, English language development, once delivery of an IEP begins, may situate the learner to fail. Lack of English development directly influences lack of academic progress expected from the delivery of the IEP. They are intertwined. And if a student is not on track to acquire English and at the rate that we would expect them to, and they don't have appropriate services and supplemental aids that they may need related to their disability needs, that will directly impact their ability to make progress on their goals in their IEP. So we have to continue to consider and provide both services and consider both their language and disability related needs as we design and deliver their individualized education programming. Next slide, please. Hopefully you had a chance to take a look at the article that was shared with you as part of the pre-reading for today. John Hoover, the article of our textbook, is one of the primary authors of this research study that examined IEPs of English learners with learning disabilities. And they were examining those IEPs for cultural and linguistic responsiveness. And they found 4 key indicators that when these things are not present, then teams typically, there is a lack of implementation of legislative mandates for delivering culturally and linguistically responsive education for multilingual learners with disabilities. So I don't want to spend a lot of time today on sort of the negative aspects, but if you are able to access an IEP for a multilingual learner for today's session, I would highly encourage you to take a look at it and take away the child's name and read that IEP as if you did not know who that student was. And would you be able to identify that that child was a multilingual learner based on how the IEP has been written? And so that was indicator number 4, right? If that IEP is unclear to another professional that that student is not a multilingual learner, that means that IEP doesn't reflect their cultural and linguistic strengths and needs. And as we think about our students who often transfer within districts and out of districts and move within and out of states, we want that IEP to be reflective of who they are and what they need and ensure their success regardless of where they are in terms of their educational schooling. Next slide, please. So as we talked about, I think it was in session 1, when we talked about the foundations of supporting multilingual learners with disabilities, the bare minimum when we're crafting an IEP for these students, you're starting off the IEP, we're looking at question C. This comes out of IDEA. Is that child identified as an English learner? If you check yes, if they have not hit the threshold of hitting 4.5 proficient on access, and they have not been reclassified as a proficient English speaker, that box should be checked yes. And the ILAP, Individual Language Acquisition Plan, should be documented in section 6 of the IEP. So in terms of compliance, that would be the bare minimum and the expectation for what we would expect to see for accountability. Next slide, please. This is where it becomes challenging, and this is where the complexity begins for most of us, is how do we answer question CI? Does the child have language needs due to their English language proficiency level, which need to be addressed? This is the question I typically get the most from educators. How do we know when to answer yes or no to that question? And it's complicated. And so this is where it really requires the collaboration and the understanding of what the government expects us to provide for students. And we know they tell us we have to consider their language needs as they relate to their IEP. What does that mean exactly? We're going to talk a little bit about that, and we're going to use a framework later to sort of practice looking at a student and thinking about how their language needs could be impacting their disability needs. Next slide, please. Please take a minute. I don't want to read this to you. I'd like you to take a minute and read this. It's complex. There's a lot here, but this is really important for helping us think about how IEP teams approach question CI. So go ahead and take a moment and read that, please. Every time I read this statement, I have to reread it multiple times because it's complex and it is really important for how we think about answering yes or no to that question. I loved how Jane framed it earlier when we were talking about it. She pulled out those keywords, whether, therefore, in addition. There is not going to be an easy checklist or answer for us to say, this is when you answer yes, and this is when you answer no. It is dependent on the IEP team who knows the student to make the determination in light of the information they have of that student on how to answer that question. Coming full circle to the collaboration piece, that's why it is essential for that team to include all the important people that can speak to all the related needs of that student. And just check the comment because I saw one pop up there. No one size fits all. Absolutely. And right, that is the point of the IEP, an individual, right? We see it laid out all the time for students. It's really dependent on what their specific needs are. Next slide, please. So in thinking about how we would answer yes or no and how do we approach supporting multilingual students with disabilities, it's really important to look through a culturally and linguistically responsive lens. The cultural and linguistic factors for our students impact not only their academic achievement, but their functional performance, the goals and expectations of what families have for their students to achieve in and outside of the classroom. And we know that existing research continually demonstrates that, I'm going to call it CLR, cultural and linguistic responsive, but CLR from now on, that education is required for our multilingual learners and our culturally diverse students to provide them appropriate opportunities in both general and special education. And that competence around CLR instruction is providing relevant, meaningful, and I would add joyful education for students to learn in an appropriate context with appropriate scaffolds for them, right? And using their cultural and linguistic strengths as capital and not barriers. And recognizing that those, for ESOL teachers, they're very familiar with looking through that assets lens, that they're leveraging their cultural and linguistic strengths and experiences to build on and transfer as students are acquiring English and content. And so in special education, we're often looking at remediating a deficit or a discrepancy. And how do we balance that requirement of special ed while also maintaining that asset-based lens of what our students bring and how we can leverage that for them? Next slide, please. I'm going to skip the next few slides, go into deeper sort of framing of culturally and linguistically responsive instruction and pedagogy. Please come back to that if that's new for you or if you want to expand your learning. I want to move us on a little bit so we can get to our breakout room. So Jane, I think we will go ahead and go to, let's see. Yes, that's a great slide. So thinking about as we're looking through that culturally and linguistically responsive lens, and we're starting to craft the IEP, the foundation of us building the IEP is looking at students' present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. I think there's different terms for that depending on your school, perhaps, your SAU. I'm going to refer to it as that PLAAFP acronym because that's what's used throughout our book. And he highlights throughout our book the important factors of an IEP and how we can embed culturally and linguistically responsive practices within each of those. And here you can see we're not just looking at their academic achievement and functional performance, we also want to reflect on their cultural and linguistic strengths and areas of need that we would want to consider when we're coming back to question CI, and do they have language-related needs that need to be addressed? Next slide, please. We're going to go ahead and skip that for now. That previous slide just is showing you some sample sentences on how to craft various components of the IEP with that CLR lens. Something we haven't talked about throughout these sessions is the importance, or we've highlighted it briefly, but the importance of family communication and engagement and participation. And especially when we're talking about culturally and linguistically responsive pedagogy, involving families who know their children best is essential. So quickly, we're going to take, just really quickly, that blue chat box. Can you think about how family and community are involved in the education of multilingual learners in your school? I would love to see some of the ways that people in this session are involving or creating community for culturally and linguistically diverse families. If you have some thoughts and ideas, can you please share them so other people can see how we're integrating families within our educational community? Absolutely, Elizabeth. Engaging families is essential so the learning transfers and continues at home, not just at school, for sure. Multilingual parent nights, covering important topics like transportation and access testing. Homework dinner nights. Oh, I love that. Homework nights with interpreters. That's awesome. Translators for paperwork, medical appointments. Yeah. Reach My Teach. It's a great tool. Multicultural families. Centering events and families. Yeah. Prayer room for Muslim students is excellent. Recognizing community needs at school. Some great ideas there. Okay, next slide, please. So this is the framework we're going to use today when you go into your breakout rooms. And you're going to have a choice with your breakout session, whether if you are physically in a learning community in your school or building or space, and you want to turn your camera off and work with the group that you're with, that's great. If you're not together with community, with fellow educators and colleagues, then joining a breakout room. We're going to keep our breakout rooms a little bit small so you can do this work together. What we're going to do is take a look at this framework. So Otella provides a framework to help us think about how are we addressing both the disability-related and language-related needs. And thinking about this graphic, which I think is a really simple, obvious graphic, but it always solidifies for me that intersection. And when we have multilingual learners with disabilities, they're doing triple the work. I think that's a really important thing to think about and to share with colleagues. We think about students walking through their day and what they're carrying and what they're trying to grapple with. Um, we ask a lot of our students. Next slide, please. So in your breakout sessions, you're going to have access to these slides. So don't feel like you need to memorize this now. But you're going to use this continuum. And this continuum is a spectrum where it has students' linguistic and disability-related needs placed on a continuum from low impact to high impact to lower development need, higher development need. And using these lenses of language and disability, trying to think about a student, and you're going to be given an example of a student, where they would fit on this quadrant in terms of their disability, their presenting needs around their disability, and their language proficiency skills and needs, where you place them on the quadrant using questions to help you, and then thinking about this particular student, how would we answer question CI for that student? So Jane, if you could go to the next slide. We're not going to use all of these questions today, but I just want to show you the questions that we can consider when we're thinking about students and thinking about the impacts of their language and their disability and how we want to support them. So let's take a look at the next slide, Jane. In breakout rooms, you're going to see this graphic. This is a student, sample student, Navin. And this graphic which I love. Again, the triple Venn diagram showing the intersection of disability, content, and language was created by WIDA. And it shows you how certain things are specific to a category and then they're overlapping. And what I want you to do with your colleagues is to look at this. They call it a communication tool, I believe. Look at this tool. Think about some of the strengths and some of the needs of Navin, how he's showing up at school. We don't have all the information we're going to need to make decisions about him. There's a lot of data here you don't have, but given the information that you have, you're going to answer some questions thinking about what his language and related needs are, his disability related challenges, and what are some supports you would put in place for him. And then, do you think this child has language needs related to his English language proficiency that would need to be addressed in the IEP? Jane put the link to the Padlet in the chat. So if you could all take a moment and click on that link and open it up. Yes, or the word no for what your team determined if you feel like Navin has language related needs that need to be addressed in his IEP. Right. So far, we're consistently getting yes. And so now, if you can put in the chat, I'm curious, where in this quadrant did your group sort of place the student given his language and disability information that you had? Did you place them in that quadrant 1 with higher ELD needs and lower disability needs? Quadrant 2, where both are high? Quadrant 3, both are low. Quadrant 4, low ELD needs and high disability. Could you just put the number in of what your groups? And if you see that your group has responded, you don't have to repeat it, but you can if you want. Nice. I was suspecting quadrant 4 also. That's where I would place the student. Is anyone feeling brave or interested in coming off mute and sharing maybe some of the conversation or a highlight of your conversation that you had in terms of using this framework to think about the student's needs? Were there any aha moments or how you could apply this to your context in your school or your building, or some questions that you may have around the framework? I know it's always awkward to come off mute and talk because you're not sure if someone else is going to. You can raise a hand if you want, but I encourage you just to come off mute if you do have something you want to share with the group or ask a question.
We talked a little bit in our group about the still being unclear if the goals that you would write for the student, like we saw that, has vocal outbursts. So clearly they might have behavioral goals for that. And we'd be working on those language needs, maybe teaching him full sentences, not just phrases to use when he's, upset or what have you. But when we check that box, is it its own separate goal, or is the understanding that the goals that are written in the IEP just support that language need?
That's an excellent question. And that question was asked during the breakout session too. Leora, do you want to answer that question?
Sure. So our guidance is to use your time and not reinvent the wheel, but to add to the goals that you already have. So you can add that where they are with their English language acquisition into the present level, or you can add, specific accommodations into the goal itself. That way you're not having to, reinvent the wheel. There's something already there for you to build on.
So adding on to that, thinking about what are always building from that present level of performance, right? And then where's the discrepancy and how do we add that into the disability related goal with those language supports or scaffolds that would need to be addressed for the student to make progress in both. We wouldn't expect to see a language acquisition related goal independently in the IEP. And goals are challenging, and our attention today was mostly just to start thinking about how we answer that question and thinking about that present level of performance as a starting point and the foundation for developing the IEP. Goals is where it gets, that's where we start rolling up our sleeves to do the hard work, for sure. We have another minute. Jane, can you perhaps go to the next slide? Here are the primary resources we use today, if you'd like to check them out. Next slide, please. Our next session will be April 29th. That's after break, so it's going to be a bit before we come back together. I believe we will be talking more around Section 3 in addition to Section 6 next time. But we'll be continuing our conversation around the IEP development next session, and we may have a guest join us also. You will receive an email probably later this week with some work to do ahead of our next session, and then the attached slide deck. And